Well, Kecia, that's the tragic part about this, was a beautiful young woman. She was 28 years old at the time of the murder. She had 2 sons. At the time, they were 5 and 9. People that knew her best said that one of her favorite things was spending time with her children.
Warning. The podcast you're about to listen to may contain graphic descriptions of violent assaults, murder, and adult language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the Murder Police Podcast. The Murder of Kecia Hughes, Part 1. Hey guys, before we dig into our next interesting podcast, I want to share with you a friend of ours podcast that has recently just been started. It's a very great friend of ours named Chuck Gunter, and his podcast is called One Movie Guy's Opinion. It's a great podcast that discusses, well, his opinions on movies. If you're interested in hearing it, it's listed on all platforms, and you can also find Chuck on Facebook as well. Again, that's One Movie Guy's Opinion. Please give it a listen. Well, David, you know, there's a couple of cases I've been on you to do with me, and at least I'm getting one, so I'm kind of proud of that. This one is the 1999 case of a young lady, age 28 at the time, named Kecia Hughes, and you actually worked this case. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
I was the lead on this one, and we've talked about what the lead is that it's more of a team effort, but this one was assigned to me, and it was the first one in Lexington for the year of 1999, as we believe that she was murdered probably sometime shortly after midnight on New Year's Eve in 1998. And we'll get into more detail about that. This was one that I actually pulled lead on, and it was a very interesting case. It spoke to me, and it stuck with me all these years about who Kecia was, and I really think it's important to memorialize her as a victim of who she was. You know, we talk about how we do this out of victim advocacy, and part of it is that we don't want people to be forgotten. And it's kind of sad because if you do a Google search for Kecia Hughes in Lexington, Kentucky, about all you find is an appeal record for her murderer, which is sad. There's really not a lot. I can't even find the older news articles that were there. They may be buried deep into the internet, but this way, if we get this case out, they'll learn more about who Kecia was and what she meant to her family and the community.
And also, you know, not to mention, we've done cases before on domestic violence. Our Amanda Ross case, who was brutally murdered by her fiancé, Steve Nunn. And sadly, this is another one on Kecia. And I think it just goes to show you there's so many that, like you said, there's not a lot of information found on it. And it just kind of gets swept under the rug and not a lot's known. So I'm glad that we are bringing Kecia Hughes' unfortunate murder to light and maybe shed some light on, like you said, who she was, a little bit about that case, and recognizing some domestic violence problems that may be in a relationship of yourself or your friend. But I did want to ask, I guess before we begin, you know, we have our other detective friends on here that goes over cases with us, and I always ask them how they began in that unit. And, you know, today we're sitting here together without a detective since you were lead on this. And I guess I want to ask you, and our listeners probably want to know as well, how did you get involved in that unit? And why don't you tell us a little bit about what year you came on, how many years you spent with the Lexington Police Department, how many years you spent actually working in homicide before getting promoted on up the ladder like you did?
Well, for me, I think one of the things that draws me to this case again, and you were right, is that it's going to be about domestic violence. And along with Amanda Ross, we had Umi Southworth and Michael Turpin and those other cases, and people can go back and listen to those again. And when you do this for a living, unfortunately, that's one of the tragic things that you deal with far too often is domestic violence and murders that may result from that. As far as me on my career, another thing that I think I feel a connection to Kecia from is that when I started with the Lexington Police Department, it was in 1992, September of 1992. And I actually moved to Lexington from Louisville, and Kecia's from Louisville. And again, that's a connection I have that I think spoke to me with her a little bit, is that she had also come to Lexington, Kentucky to start a life and to move here. So in 1992, I packed up everything and headed down the road and started working here at Lexington. I was very fortunate to get a job with the Lexington Police Department, and did like everybody else did. You do your time on the road and patrol, which is a requirement. But I do know that I was invited into the unit rather early, and we've had a couple people that mentioned that too. And the way I got in is that Sergeant Dan Gibbons, who we've had on this show before, he did the Trent DeGero podcast, which I got to work on that case, and this will explain more about where I was in my career at that time when I did do that. But Sergeant Dan Gibbons asked if I would come up on a temporary assignment basis, which is a pretty big deal. Now, I'd been asked to come into another part of investigations several weeks before, and actually turned that down because I felt like I needed more time on the road. And plus, I had a fantastic beat partner, Dwayne Holman. A lot of people will know who Dwayne is. He just retired as an assistant chief. We were really, really good beat partners. And in our work, when you get a good beat partner, that's hard to leave because you probably aren't going to get another magical experience like that where you think the same and enjoy working with each other. However, I turned down that first one because I was enjoying my time on patrol. It was a little different when Sergeant Dan Gibbons called, though, because one, Dan's reputation for being a mentor, and he was a mentor, was before him. It was an opportunity that I'd been an idiot not to go take and move up there for a little while and learn from him. It really didn't have much to do with what kind of work we were doing so much as working for Dan. That's how much I admired him and still do to this day. That said, I ended up going up there, and it was a temporary assignment. So what that means is that, you're going to go up there from anywhere from a few weeks to maybe a couple months or whatever. But fortunately, it turned into a very long-term assignment. I was up there for several years. I remember getting there and working through some cases, and career-wise, I stayed there for several years, and then I ended up leaving the unit, and I left because I was raising my daughter, Brooke, and needed to be able to be available for her more. And we can talk more about how grueling that is in that unit as far as call-outs and how long you're away from home and stuff like that. As a matter of fact, I think I had the epiphany. I was in Washington, D.C., and we were shooting America's Most Wanted on a case that I had. And it was on Halloween, and I was balancing the idea that my daughter was having her first Halloween and I was away. So it was like you're having this really neat career experience, but you're missing that home life thing. But that led me to my next assignment in my career, and that was the intelligence unit. And that was interesting. Within about a year of me landing in there, we had the 9/11 attack, and everything changed significantly. And that was an amazing experience to be working with the anti-terrorism task force with the feds and things like that. That was nice. After that, I got that first promotion to sergeant, ran our computer unit for a while. We were instrumental, me and that unit, in putting computers in cars and going to electronic reporting, which was a pretty big watershed moment for the police department. After that, I moved up to the rank of lieutenant, got promoted to that, and spent some time in different assignments there. I was anything from a patrol lieutenant where I started there, went back inside and worked as the administrative assistant to the assistant chief of patrol for a while, and then finally wound up in planning and analysis, where you get a really big view of what the police department is in a place like that. After that, I was fortunate enough to, in my final rank, I was appointed, which is different than being promoted to commander, and had a few assignments before that. My last 5 years was at the rank of commander at the command staff level, and I had the opportunity. My first assignment there was to go back to general investigations, which felt like going home because that's where robbery, homicide, and all investigative units were that people typically engage with. Came back out, worked into a patrol sector with some fantastic people in East Sector that'll always hold a special place in my heart for those people in East Sector that I got to work with. And then my last assignment before I retired, I spent a couple years over special investigations, which is just what that sounds. That had things like narcotics, it had intelligence, backgrounds, forensics, it had everything. It was all the neat, nitty-gritty stuff. So I had a really good career. And then ultimately, I just recently retired after 28 years of service.
Well, going back to homicide, you clearly didn't toot your horn enough in that. Tell the listeners, how long were you in homicide? And if you had to guess, roughly, how many cases did you work?
I'll tell you what, it was a handful of years, 5 or 6. I moved on pretty quickly. I wish I'd stayed longer. I know that it was my favorite assignment. I've always, and I think I've said it on the show, is that by the time I retired, I had a significant collection of badges. And my favorite badge in that shadow box is where they're all at now, is the one that says detective because of the time spent up there. To be honest with you, I've never thought about how many I had or how many I worked. I'd have to really go back and start pulling numbers to look at that. But I can say that we were always busy. You always had something on your plate, and there was always new ones coming in. And just like you've heard the other detectives here and at other agencies talk, is just because you have a full plate, it doesn't mean you just get to eat alone, is you're also working with other people's cases as well. It was a huge experience in that aspect. I think that was my favorite thing about it, is that I've always said that in my career, it was my favorite assignment. Nothing other came up next to it because of the people I got to work with. And that's one of the reasons I enjoy doing the podcast, is bringing these people in and letting them relive some of those experiences that they had. And especially if I got to have those with them, is enjoyable. But the team experience was amazing. It being in the unit itself, it was busy. It's like raking leaves on a windy day. You know, we talked a little bit on cold case investigation about what the real struggle is you'll get assigned a case, and within a few days, sometimes you'll get the next one dropped. And we're only made of people in this business and working those, so you're busy. It's very time-consuming, around the clock. It's not something you leave at work. If you do leave in the afternoon to go home, you not only have the risk of the fact there's a high likelihood you'll be called back out in a few hours or several hours to work through the night again, but you're also, trust me, you're always thinking about these cases. And I would say that myself and the people that I work with, and I'm sure they still do it to this day, a lot of the work that gets done in these cases is off the clock. It's just because you're working them in your brain the whole time that you're doing them. It was humbling. I know you mentioned the word toot your horn, but one of the things about this kind of work is that it requires humility and it will deliver it. If people get a piece of humble pie, they'll get a whole pie if they come to this unit because of the weight you carry in representing these crime victims and their families when you do that kind of work. And it had its ups and downs. You know, there's still cases I look back at that I had that haven't closed. I know the cold case unit has looked at a few of those and takes a peek at them every now and then. It's always frustrating when you can't get back to those. And probably the biggest thing that people from the outside don't understand too is that it's enjoyable work, but a little dark thing in law enforcement, and I'll get a hallelujah from a lot of cops if they're listening, or former cops, is that job really is dependent upon your leadership. So I'll just say this. When your leadership in a certain environment is good, you're gold and you're having a good time. When the leadership's not good, that's a down. We'll leave that at that for now. Maybe we'll do another show on that one time. It was an interesting work in the fact that you're always learning. You're baptized in the fire. I remember that I got my first lead case. I think I was up there for 2 or 3 days. And we had a body found on Davidson Avenue, and I got assigned that. And that was a real trust message from Sergeant Dan Gibbons to be able to take and give you a case that early on, which, again, that's one of the reasons I respect him so much. But the experience was amazing, and I don't think anything in my career could ever come close to that, or the people that I got to work with. And again, finally, I moved on from it to go to the intel unit and moved away from there. There's a part of me that wish I'd stayed. You know, when we're talking to Chris Schoonover and he made a career out of it, there's a part of me that wish I'd stayed with it to that point, but it wasn't going to work well for the family part. So, and that's what comes first.
Well, so now that our listeners know some of your background, moving on to this case, why don't you tell us a little bit about this case? What about it stuck out to you before we move into the nuts and bolts of it, if you will?
Well, again, this one's always stuck with me. Unfortunately, it was a domestic violence case. It also was one that, as we dug deeper into it, that we had found prior acts of domestic violence and accusations. And then it had that same sad, tragic element to where, according to witness statements, Kecia was about to leave her husband. And it seems that that's always the most dangerous time for people, I believe, is when they go to terminate the relationship, is when that happens. The case itself was also interesting in that, you know, we always talk about, well, where we're doing and what we're doing when we get it. And in this case, it was one of those two where it's not a whodunit. It was a rapid fire, really close identification on who the suspect was, obviously, because the way it transpired that we'll learn about, which presented some challenges in itself, because you'll hear that when we, and for example, talk to a suspect after that, we don't have a lot of information in the moment, but we have to do the interview then, if that makes any sense. And you're going to see how quickly this one landed in our laps up in the unit that day. The case also, I think what stuck with me quite a bit with it is that we're going to learn that this was bizarre because the suspect actually had somehow construed an alibi, which likely could have been very successful had his timing been a little bit different. And I'll tell people about that. That's always tripped me out about this case, is that somewhere along the line he had really planned a decent alibi that would have been made this a very difficult case to close in on him. However, his timing destroyed that probably. And then also we'll talk a little bit about how we actually got information from people that were incarcerated with him in the past, which is tricky stuff to work with, but was interesting to build the background on who he was. So those are the things I think that stuck out with me about this case that just I find it interesting that it stuck with me over all these years.
Well, David, before we dig into this, and I ask you what you were doing, which our listeners know I love to know from the very, very beginning what our detectives were doing prior to the call going out, why don't we back up a little bit and you tell our listeners about Kecia Hughes?
Well, Kecia, that's the tragic part about this, was a beautiful young woman. She was 28 years old at the time of the murder. She had been married to her husband, Troy Hughes, for about 2 years. She had 2 sons. At the time, they were 5 and 9, and they were not Troy's children. They were from another relationship. People described her as being quiet, somewhat of an introvert, and she worked at a local hospital or clinic in the area in the medical field. The people that knew her best said that one of her favorite things was spending time with her children. She really enjoyed being with those. She had 3 siblings that were biological and 3 step-siblings. Pretty big-sized family. And again, she was originally from Louisville and came to Lexington.
So she comes to Lexington. Do you know, had she met Troy prior to coming to Lexington? Did they meet in Louisville and move here, or did she meet him here?
I believe, looking back, that she met him in Louisville, and then she convinced him to come to Lexington with her.
Okay. So this case, tell us about when the call went out, how it went out. Obviously, you weren't in patrol at the time, so you probably wouldn't have been first dispatched. So tell us, back up a little and tell us how it began.
Well, this one was interesting. And again, I was relatively new in the unit because it was the first of the year. On January 3rd, I was at the police department working. That's what was interesting about these. And the dynamic on this is incredibly important to understand. Is we had a scene going on in North Lexington up in the Hamburg area on Bainbridge at some apartments. And what had happened is that a family had asked for the police department to do a welfare check on Kecia because they hadn't heard from her for a few days. Now, all of this is going on without the knowledge of the Detective Bureau yet, because as we know, there's a point where patrol will involve us when it becomes necessary. So in the back of this, early on January 3rd, is that the police are attempting a welfare check on Kecia at her apartment. They're not having a lot of luck. As a matter of fact, early in that morning, her husband, Troy Hughes, meets them at the door but won't let them in. He keeps opening and closing it. She's tired. She doesn't want to wake up. This is probably about 8 or 9 in the morning, if I remember correctly. They make a decision to come back a little bit later, working with the assumption that, she's probably in bed and doesn't want to speak to anybody. They didn't have anything at that time to rattle her cage and make it seem more suspicious than it was. So they come back. In the meantime, the family increasingly is getting more and more concerned because they hadn't heard from her. And at one point, her mother goes ahead and does a missing persons report with a patrol officer. They end up going back to the apartment later in the afternoon, and with the assistance of a manager as they enter the apartment, and Troy's not there. And when the officers go in the apartment, the first thing they noticed is a very foul odor. And they recognize that as probably somebody that's been dead for a while, the decomposition, because once you've smelled that, that's something that's very unique, and you never forget it, and they know what it is. So they smell that, and they do a cursory search of the apartment, and they locate who we later found out to be Kecia back in the bedroom, in the bed, deceased, and moving well through decomposition phases at that time, which would explain the odor.
Now, were her children there as well?
No, the children were back in Louisville at the time, which was fantastic that they weren't anywhere around any of this when it went on. So again, they start to deal with this and they put things together really rapidly, so they know they've got to try to locate the husband that was there earlier that wouldn't let him in. The way they described it was interesting, how he kept closing. And if you can imagine, like somebody just opening the door just a few inches and speaking through it and then closing it and coming back and saying, no, she's tired and she's still asleep and I don't want to wake her up. But whatever the conversation was, it was like that. That's what they were dealing with. Once they found her body, of course, everything accelerates and goes into high gear. At that point, they were attempting to contact the coroner, and they reach out to them to get them to respond. And that's probably about the first time that up in the Detective Bureau we get the first sign that something's gone wrong when they find a deceased person in that apartment. Now, ironically enough, as they put out an attempt to locate, we call it an ATL, on her car and on Troy, is some patrol officers notice him in the area operating that car. They go to pull the car over. He jumps out of the car, bails, and a foot pursuit ensues, and they end up tackling him and get him on the ground. They take him into custody at that moment. Now, later we'll get into the alibi, because what was interesting is that at around the same time that they're actually taking him and getting physical control of him here, someone is checking out of a hotel room up near St. Louis, which is 7 or 8 hours away, plus snow and plus really bad weather conditions on the roads up there. But somebody's checking out of a hotel room that had used his ID to check in, which we'll cover that more in the alibi section about how that could have worked well for him had he had not come back and driven in the area. So here, taking it back into how we get involved. Pretty much you're in the office, you're going through your routines, you're handling your other cases, you're doing paperwork and things like that. Patrol calls and says, we've got this. And that's the way it comes to you. We've got a woman that was reported missing. We did a welfare check. They give you the real quick rundown on it. And by the way, we have this guy and we're bringing him down to headquarters to interview. Now, that's the interesting thing that I talked about before, is that in the good side of it, you probably have something that is now cleared as soon as you've recognized it. It sounds like it's going to be because of who they've brought in. But as an investigator, you have to imagine what it's like that you're going to get one attempt at interviewing this person, and you're going to have limited information about what you're going to be able to talk about. And you have to move pretty quickly. You can't sit on this and put, for example, put them in a holding room for 12 hours while you look at the scene and talk to everybody that's involved. So this is where the coordination between patrol and all the other units and investigations becomes really, really critical. They end up bringing Troy to police headquarters, and that's where I met him. He had been Mirandized out in the field. I think it was Officer Ricky Lynn, fantastic friend of mine, was the person that actually Mirandized him out in the field. He didn't make any statements at that time on the way down to headquarters. And by the way, the officers that responded to the scene also were Officer Varney and Officer Chenault. Really good people to work with. So what happens is when you get somebody like that down there, then the whole thrust of this is how much information can you put together before you go in the interview room. So by that time, we're talking to people that were out at the scene, what it was like. And according to them, and I learned, and when I did a scene walkthrough later, I found this to be the case, is that she was found in that back bedroom. There were some body fluids present. It was hard to say then if it was because of an assault or decomposition. But the other thing, too, is that they talked about how there were several air fresheners in the apartment scattered about. Those Glade things, the little pop-ups and things like that.
The trees, the hanging trees.
Yeah, anything like that. The whole place was full of those. So that led you to believe that it supports the idea that she's been down for some time, which we knew because of the decomposition. But it also was important information because that came up in an interview later to help me get through that. So at the same time, you have people in our domestic violence section are running record checks on this person to see if they have any records on the husband, Troy Hughes, to see what his background was. Because it's important, again, to try to get as much of this together as you can before you get in that interview room. They talked a little bit to the family, and the gist they got from the family out on patrol was that the family had known of trouble in the relationship for some time, and they believed at this point that Kecia was really attempting to leave Troy, that she was done with the relationship. And again, that's a very dangerous time in a domestic violence situation.
Well, you've talked a little bit about Kecia and what kind of person she was, who she was. And we've talked about Troy, and obviously he a little on the shady side with opening and the closing the door and, in the domestic violence which resulted in killing her. Why don't you shed a little light on just who he was?
Yeah, that'd be good. Like I said, they were married at about 2 years. Troy, at the time of the murder, was a 33-year-old, and he was working as a restaurant cook here in Lexington. His full name was Troy Dwayne Hughes. We had gathered pretty quickly that he was not well liked by her family. According to them, he was always trying to drive wedges between Kecia and her family, which, if you look at domestic abusers, that's one of the things that we look at and identify as a red flag, is that isolation and that control that they try to perform, and that was pretty clear in this too. The family described him as having an attitude that summed up to whatever a man says goes and the woman has no say. And later we'll talk more about how that's what we gathered from some of the inmates in some of the corrections facilities where they had been housed with Troy in the past, is that he really lived that. That was actually a part of who he was. Now, what was interesting is when the domestic violence unit was doing the research, they found out that back in Louisville in Jefferson County, they found 2 prior domestic violence incidents. And this is really important to understand too, because of the patterns that exist in this kind of a thing. Is the first one is that on December 9th, 1996, a judge had found him guilty of domestic violence after Kecia said he hit, choked, and threatened to kill her. He was ordered into anger counseling by the judge for 16 weeks, which he apparently completed. Now, doing some of the research on this case outside of my case notes, I found some newspaper articles about that very thing. And article I found, and we'll post this on the website, from the Herald Leader, talked about how even back then it was questionable whether anger management counseling was doing any good in these domestic violence cases. And the opinion back then, and I'd say it's still a strong opinion in mine today, is it probably doesn't do a whole lot for these. It's just they run people through these things, and I guess they expect them to come out completely differently. But in this case, it obviously didn't have an impact like they thought it would.
Well, and I think also, not only does it possibly not work, if you have a person, and this is strictly my opinion, if you have a person that is already of that mindset and that demeanor and treats other people like that, I'm sorry, I just don't think you can stick them in a class once a week for 16 weeks and reform that person and make them into a whole new person who's been aggressive their whole life, and now they've had this epiphany mere couple of months later, and now they're a turnaround person. I just don't think that works. And clearly in this case, it proved that it did not work.
Yeah, I've always looked at it kind of like the analogy I use is the car auto body shop that I think people make a mistake with human beings about. If you get an fender bender, you can take your car to an auto body shop, point out the fender that's dented, leave it there for a week, maybe 2 weeks, and come back, and the car comes back, and you can never tell it's been in an accident, and it runs fine for the rest of its workable life, I guess. People aren't that way, and I think there's a huge naive belief sometimes that you can change people. And I don't think you can change people. People can change themselves if they're motivated. But the idea that I'm going to put you through a process and get a result is pretty naive. And I think that we see that far too often.
Well, and I think also the courts who order this, I think it's kind of putting a Band-Aid on it and covering their behind, saying, well, hey, I put him in classes for 16 weeks and he completed it. We did our part. And I don't know how much you can do about that legally aside of those classes. But I think for places like that, they just think they slap a Band-Aid on it, send you to a couple classes, and you're all brand new again. And I feel like if a person is a domestic abuser, why is not more done other than classes?
Well, I think, the first thing we fall back, I think what it falls back to is that we put a lot of weight on trying to gather enough information to convince a court to hand down emergency protective orders and then hopefully have those turn into domestic violence orders with conditions on somebody. That seems to be the best way that we have to deal with this. However, we've said before in some of the other cases that we've covered, and people will see this as true, that still in itself has some limitations when it comes to whatever the drive is of the offender on how bent they are on actually carrying out acts of violence, is that unfortunately those things don't always work as well as we'd like. To give you an example on this case, hardly a year later, after that December 1996 judgment from the judge, is that he was charged with stalking her on April 8th, 1997, along with assault and terroristic threatening, and an emergency protective order was issued at that time. Now, that EPO eventually was a domestic violence order, but it had expired by the time that the assault and murder occurred here in Lexington. I think right now would be a good time to offer some information for people listening before we go further on this, that if somebody feels like they're in a domestic violence situation or a potential domestic violence situation, is to reach out as fast as possible for help. Obviously, you can call 911, you can call your local police department, but the thing I want to get across is that there are people with experience that are experts that can help you plan, they can help you strategize in these situations to help you with a better outcome. For example, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is what we recommend on here, and that number is 1-800-799-SAFE, and that's 7233. One more time, that's the National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-SAFE, or 799-7233. And before we move forward one more time, there are people that can really help with this, that have much more experience than I do, or most of the people that I work with, on the particulars about how to navigate through a horrible time in your life like this. And we strongly recommend calling people for that kind of help if you find yourself in that situation. So we look back at what we know about Troy, and all of that, some of that we knew going in the interview room. We had a taste of. You've got to understand that when I went to interview him and sit in the room with him, is we had some background information from the family. We had a very suspicious circumstance at the scene with him being at the apartment, not being at the apartment, getting into the apartment, finding her in a fairly advanced state of decomposition, all the air fresheners, things like that. That's what we walked into the room with. And so when I sit down with him in the room, there was one more thing that Officer Ricky Lynn found in Troy's pocket when he took him into custody that played a big role on where I went with that interview.
Hey, you know there's more to the story, so go download the next episode like the true crime fan that you are.
The Murder Police podcast is hosted by Wendy and David Lyons and was created to honor the lives of crime victims so their names are never forgotten. It is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lyons. The Murder Police podcast can be found on your favorite Apple or Android podcast platform, as well as at murderpolicepodcast.com, where you will find show notes, transcripts, information about the presenters, and much, much more. We are also on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, which is closed captions for those that are hearing impaired. Just search for the Murder Police podcast and you will find us. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe for more and give us 5 stars and a written review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast from. Make sure to subscribe to the Murder Police podcast and set your player to automatically download new episodes so you get the new ones as soon as they drop. And please tell your friends. Lock it down, Judy.